Done? Can everybody hear me? Michael, hear me? Good morning. Steve, good morning. Good morning. We begin today's daf. Daf Samach Vav Mesachas Bava Basra. We begin by thanking all of our sponsors. We thank our Talmud Torah sponsor for the month of Menachem Av, the Tilson and Wolf families of Eretz Yisrael. We also thank Nathan and Beth Adler for sponsoring all of the Shurim of the week in memory of Benjamin Adler, Achavar Baruch, Mordechai Ben Merenu of Nassan. We also thank Leah Sol for sponsoring today's daf, wishing Mazel Tov to the Rav and the Rebbitzin on the birth of a grandson born to Avram and Zizi Silber. The bris will, Eretz Hashem, be B'Shah Teva this morning. And Mazel Tov to the Rav, to Avram and Zizi, and to the entire Silber Mishpacha. We should have a lot of nachas and bracha from this young child. We also thank Leah Sol for sponsoring, wishing Mazel Tov to Robin Schaefer on her upcoming marriage this week. Mazel Tov, Robin. We are going to begin on Daf Samachet, just a quick review of what happened yesterday at the end of yesterday's shir, and then we will continue. So there's this line that we have from Rabbi Eliezer, who says, "Kol ha'mechuber lekarka harehu kekarka." In other words, the discussion over here was talking about when a person has a home. They sell a home, and included in the home, in this particular case, we're talking about a machteshes. It's just important to note that, the three lines from before the Rashbam gets very wide. The Rashbam points out that Rabbi Eliezer is talking about this machteshes kavua. So what is this machteshes? It's this built-in pestle and mortar system. So you have this mortar that's built into the ground. So Rabbi Eliezer says if it's attached to the ground, it's considered to be part of the ground. And since it's considered to be part of the ground, it's included in this real estate transaction over here. That was the line Rabbi Eliezer said. And then he goes on, the Gemara just ends up. If a person clearly articulates when he's talking about the sale that this home includes everything that's inside of it, so then in such a case everything is sold. However, so these things are always considered to be exceptions. The bar, the dus, we described a number of times, the bar and dus are basically the same thing, except that a bar is a simple hole in the ground, but a dus is a built-in hole in the ground, and the yitzia is kind of like this extension of a home, not really part of the house, but an extension of a home. It has like some kind of enclosed porch, which is not really as high, but ultimately those things are not included. As today's Gemara is going to quote a brisa about mikvah, and it's going to tell us that this brisa about mikvah is not consistent with Rabbi Eliezer or the Rabbanan. It's going to focus mostly on Rabbi Eliezer. Today's Gemara is going to try to find which part of Rabbi Eliezer is not consistent with this Gemara. That's going to be our topic of today. So let's start the Gemara for today as follows. Tana Rabbanan. Tzinor shechakaku l'besof kavo. So let's just give a brief introduction. The halacha of mikvah is, if a person wants to become tahar from tumah, they have to immerse themselves either into a mayan or into a mikvah. A mayan is a live stream and is not subject to all of the halachas of a mikvah. A live stream can be zochel and it can be flowing water. It does not have to be ashboren, which is the opposite. Ashboren is when it's steady, and it doesn't have to either be 40 sa'ah, but when it comes to a mikvah where you're gathering water from someplace else and holding it in a particular place, the halacha is you have to have 40 sa'ah of mei geshamim. 40 sa'ah of mei geshamim, it can't be mayim she'uvim. So a person can't just simply make a hole in their backyard, bring their garden hose to that hole, fill it up with water and call that a mikvah. That would not be a kosher mikvah. That would not work to be matayar a person from tumah. Rather, what has to happen is they have to have a mikvah, which again, the construction of the mikvah is quite complicated, how it has to be. We're not going to go through all of that right now, but ultimately, it has to be considered that it's part of the ground. If it's part of the ground, rainwater gathers there. If rainwater gathers there, then that becomes a kosher mikvah for a person to be able to become tahar from his tumah, as long as it has the required 40 sa'ah of mei geshamim. What is considered mayim she'uvim? Mayim she'uvim is any water that went into a keli, any water that went into a vessel and then was transferred there. So, therefore, if you have a pipe, which is a vessel, So you have a regular pipe, and you put the water through that pipe, then that water, by definition, will become mayim she'uvim. Exactly how it works, again, that's beyond the scope of today's shiur, how to build a mikvah, but there's a number of things that we do in construction, in the construction of a modern day mikvah, whether it's hashaka, or it's hazra, hamshacha v'hashaka, all those different halachas are fascinating, but beyond the scope of today's shiur. Now, what we're discussing over here is, if a person has a pipe, so let's look through it. Tzinar shachakaku l'basov kavu. Person takes a pipe. What is a pipe? So it's interesting. It's called a pipe in this Gemara, shachakaku, that was carved out. The truth is, it's not a pipe until you carve it out. But we're calling it a tzinar al shem sofa. In other words, by its name at the end of the story. So you have this. Let's just call it a solid piece of wood. Now, if you are chakaku, it means you carve it out to be a pipe. Now it's a keli, ulubasof kavo, and at the end, you took that pipe and connected it to the ground. Posel sa mikvah, that would disqualify a mikvah. Why? Because it was already a pipe. It was already a keli before you connected it to the ground. So the fact that you connected it to the ground doesn't take away its name as being a keli. It still is a keli. Therefore, when the water goes through that keli, through that vessel, the water is considered to be drawn water, not rainwater. Drawn water is always going to passel the mikvah, it's going to ruin the mikvah, but rainwater will make it kosher. Now, kavu, however, what happens if you take this block of wood, you first connect it to the ground, so when it's a block of wood, it's simply a block of wood. You connect it to the ground, now it's connected to the ground, and then l'basof, at the end chakaku, you go ahead, you carve it out to being a pipe. Eino posel sa mikvah, it does not destroy the mikvah. Now the Gemara wants to know, who is the one who makes this distinction? In other words, Rabbi Eliezer told us every time you take a keli and you connect it to the ground, it becomes part of the ground. In this particular case, it's not so clear that just connecting it to the ground makes it part of the ground. There's a criteria that has to be met, which is that yes, it has to be connected to the ground, but not only does it have to be connected to the ground, it has to be connected to the ground before it became a keli. If it became a keli before it was connected to the ground, that's not going to be sufficient, and it's still going to ruin the mikvah. Now, I want to just throw something out here also, parenthetically, because it's going to be relevant later on in today's Gemara, but about this mayim she'uvim. Once a mikvah is a kosher mikvah, it has 40 sa'ah of water in it, of mei geshamim. At that point in time, it's much more difficult to ruin that mikvah. As a matter of fact, there's something called nosan sa v'notal sa, which means you take out, you first pour in drawn water. In other words, you have a mikvah which is kosher. It has the required 40 sa'ah of water in it, of rainwater. You then go ahead and pour in 1 sa'ah of water from the tap. The halacha is it's kosher. Now, what happens if after you do that, you take out another sa'ah of water and pour it down the drain? So now you still have 40 sa'ah, but if you do the math, it comes out that in that 1 sa'ah that you took out, if it all mixed up, you'll have 1 part of that is going to be rainwater. Now the halacha is you're allowed to do that up until the majority of the original rainwater was taken out. That's one way of ruining the mikvah. There's another way of ruining the mikvah, which is where if you have 39 sa'ah of rainwater, and then you put in 3 lugin, another measurement, 3 lugin of drawn water, you have ruined that entire mikvah. It's beyond repair. So again, when we're talking about ruining a mikvah, there are different ways to ruin it. Some might ruin it midoraisa, some might ruin it midrabana. Furthermore, filling up an entire pit with drawn water is definitely not a kosher mikvah. And that's definitely true midoraisa. The question is, of these 3 cases that I gave you, which one ruins it midrabanan, which one ruins it midoraisa? We're going to get to that later in today's Gemara, because the Gemara seems to flip-flop a little bit on whether this Mayim She'uvim disqualification, this drawn water disqualification, is that Midoraisa or is that Midrabanan? The reason why it seems to go back and forth is because there are several different cases of how Mayim She'uvim, how drawn water, can actually ruin a mikvah. In some cases, it would indeed be Midoraisa, but in other cases, it would only be Midrabanan. Now let's go on with the Gemara. Now the Gemara says, Mani, who is the author of the Brisa that distinguishes with regard to this pipe and tells us that only if you first connect it to the ground and then carve it out will it be good, but if you carve it out first and then connect it to the ground, it's going to disqualify the mikvah. Lo Rabbi Eliezer, v'lo Rabbanan. It can't be Rabbi Eliezer, and it can't be the Rabbanan. Now the Gemara seems to put more attention on Rabbi Eliezer than on the Rabbanan. The Gemara says, Hi Rabbi Eliezer. Which Rabbi Eliezer, which quote of Rabbi Eliezer is inconsistent with this previous brisa about a mikvah? The Gemara attempts a few tries. Ilema, if you want to suggest Rabbi Eliezer the bias, Rabbi Eliezer of the bias, who says that if you sell a home, it comes with all connected appliances, all built-in appliances. So therefore, if you have this machtashes, this mortar, which is built into the home, Rabbi Eliezer says, yes, it's included in the real estate transaction, and that would be inconsistent with the brisa. So the Gemara says, no. Those two cases have nothing to do with each other. Dilma hainu tamed Rabbi Eliezer. It's possible that the reason why Rabbi Eliezer says that the built-in machtashes is sold with the house is why? Because he's Rabbi Eliezer Savar Mocher ba'ayin yafa mocher. Simply analyzing a person's attitude when they sell real estate, is a person who sells real estate generally going to be more generous with the buyer, or is he going to only sell the minimum of what's required? So he's of the opinion that a real estate transaction is done with generosity, and therefore, with generosity, you'll include a built-in machtashes. But that has nothing to do with a halachic definition of what's considered to be connected to the ground, in so much that it would actually disqualify or qualify a mikvah for being kosher. So therefore, the two cases have nothing to do with each other. Again, what's the flip side of that? Rabbanan Savri, Rabbanan who say that machtashes is not included, Sover, that Savri of the opinion that mocher ba'ayin ra mocher, a real estate transaction is always sold with only the minimum of what's required. A seller only gives what he has to, and therefore does not include the built-in machtashes. Okay, so that case cannot be the Rabbi Eliezer that's inconsistent with the mikvah case, because it's very possible that Rabbi Eliezer would say a built-in machtashes is included in a real estate transaction, but still tell us that if you have a pipe that is already called a pipe and then it's connected to the ground, then that will still maintain its name as a pipe, and it would ruin the mikvah by turning the water into drawn mayim she'uvim. Okay, ve'ela Rabbi Eliezer to kaveres devarim. It must be that the Rabbi Eliezer that we were referring to when we said it's inconsistent with the mikvah case is the case of Rabbi Eliezer with regard to the beehive. The Tanan, for we learned in a Mishnah, Kaveras Devarim, person has a beehive. Rabbi Eliezer Omer Eliezer says, Harehi kekarka. A beehive is considered to be like real estate, like karka, like land. Now, what's this real estate? What's this Kaveras Devarim? This Kaveras Devarim seems to be a beehive that was subsequently attached to the ground. The Rashbam tells us that it was connected with tit. It had some type of mortar that was used to connect it to the ground. Not a mortar, like a pestle mortar, like cement that was connected to the ground. The Kos V'Nala Prosbol. Now, we go through a list of things that need karka. In other words, when we say something is considered to be karka, and the Rashbam points this out immediately as well, which is when we say something is considered karka, that means that with regard to a kinyan, to acquiring it, you'd have to use kesef, shtar, and chazaka, like all other karka. But the Gemara gives a whole list of things that require karka, that require a piece of property for it to work, and the Gemara says a kaveras devarim meet that criteria. So what are these things? V'kos v'noleh pruzbol. You can write a pruzbol Ana kaveras dvorim. Quick reminder, what's a prosbol? A prosbol is that the halacha is at the end of Shemitah, all loans become mishamet. They get canceled. That means if a person owes someone money at the end of Shemitah, there's a halacha, he's supposed to be mishamet those loans. Now the problem was Hillel recognized that people were violating an issur midaraisa. So it says, person should be very careful that they should not stop lending money to people out of fear that they won't get their money back at the end of Shemitah. Nevertheless, people did not want to lend any money during that season because people recognized that there was a huge chance they weren't going to be able to get their money back. So Hillel was misakin a prosbol. A prosbol is a document where a person transfers all his loans to Beis Din. And when those loans are transferred to Beis Din, what happens is Beis Din has the right to still collect those loans, and those loans will not be canceled at the end of Shemitah. There is another understanding of how this works, but that's the simple understanding. It gets transferred to Beis Din. Now, in order to write a prosbol, the lova, the borrower, has to own a piece of karka. Why is that true? Again, there's two reasons for it, but the simple understanding is that it's just considered to be uncommon for a person to lend money to somebody who does not have any real estate, because there's no security. It's an insecure loan if a person has no real estate. So only in common cases did Hillel make this takana. Therefore, a person has to have a little bit of real estate in order for a prosbol to work. The other reason is that it's considered, if there is a tangible item of property there, it's as if the loan was already started to be collected. The bottom line is, in order for a prosbol to work, it has to be that the debtor, the one who owes the money, owns a little piece of karka, and guess what? Owning a beehive which is connected to the ground meets that criteria, and you could use that to write a prosbol. The Einim Mekabel Tumah B'Koma, top of Samach Vav and Aleph, a beehive is not Mekabel Tumah as long as it's still in that place. In other words, where it is connected to the ground. Why? Because it's considered Mechober L'Karka. It's considered to be considered to be land, karka, and therefore it's not mekabel tuma. If you uproot it, then it becomes susceptible to tuma. According to Rabbi Eliezer, if a person takes honey out of this beehive on Shabbos, he's chayav achatos. Why? It's just like harvesting. Person takes some tomatoes off of his tomato plant in his backyard, is chayav achatas. The same thing is true if a person takes honey out of a beehive which is connected to the ground. According to Rabbi Eliezer, he's chayav achatas, just like detaching any fruit from the ground. The Chachamim disagree and say no. A beehive is eino kakarka. It's not like karka, and therefore ve'ein kosvan aleh prosbol. You cannot use a beehive to write this prosbol document. Mekabelas tumah b'mkoma, and it will be mekabel tumah like any other metalton, like any other movable objects. Barodu mena b'Shabbos, potter. A person takes honey from here on Shabbos, they are potter. It's important to note the word over here that was used by the Chachamim is harodu mena b'Shabbos, potter. Potter does not mean mutter when it comes to Shabbos. When it comes to Shabbos, it's interesting. Whenever we find the word potter, it always comes along with a parenthetical avol aser. It's potter. A person is not obligated to bring a chatas if they did this by mistake. However, it's still aser midrabanan to do it. So says the Gemara, perhaps this Rabbi Eliezer is the Rabbi Eliezer that is inconsistent with the brisa about mikvah. Why? Because Rabbi Eliezer over here says that any time you have something which is connected to the ground, it automatically assumes its name as being part of the ground. So you have a beehive which is connected to the ground. Rabbi Eliezer says it will always be considered part of the ground. He doesn't make a distinction like we do with regard to mikvah, to say it depends when exactly you hollowed it out. Depends when you're going to carve out this pipe. So maybe this is the Rabbi Eliezer that's inconsistent. Again, Gemara says, no, this is not true. Hasam, in that case, K'da Amar, Rabbi Eliezer Taima. There's a special reason why Rabbi Eliezer considers a beehive to be part of the ground. With the Amar Rabbi Eliezer says, my Taima, Rabbi Eliezer. Why is it that Rabbi Eliezer tells us the beehive is part of the ground? So there's Rabbi Eliezer here and Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer is the one who tells us that the beehive is considered part of the ground. Rabbi Eliezer explains to us why Rabbi Eliezer says that. How does he explain it? My time is Rabbi Eliezer, where it says in the pasuk, "V'yitbol osa beyaros dvash." Ma'yara talosh b'menu b'Shabbos chayav chatas, af dvash rod b'menu b'Shabbos chayav chatas. So quickly, what was this talking about? In Sefer Shmuel Aleph, there is a story with regard to one of the Mechamos that was going on between the Yidden, led by Shaul and the Pelishtim. And at that point in time, Shaul said, Aror ha'ish, cursed shall be the person who will eat anything until Erev. I think it says, Asher yochal lechem ad ha'erev. Anybody who will eat anything up until this evening. Yonasan, his own son, did not know that his father forbade everybody from eating that day. Yonasan was exhausted, and he found some honey. He took his staff, he dipped it into some honey. That's what the pasuk is talking about over here. It says, Vayitbol osa beyaros devash. He took his staff, he dipped into the honey, he ate some honey, he was rejuvenated, and afterwards there's a whole story as to whether or not Yonasan should have been kept alive or not. That's, again, beyond the scope of today's share. But what does it say? It says he dipped his staff, ayitpal osa, he dipped it in, biyaras devash, in the forest of honey. Now, we're familiar with the term Yaros Devash because Rabbi Yonasan Abshus wrote Sfarim and he titled them Yaros Devash. So it's kind of like a terminology we use, Yaros Devash. When you think about it, a forest of honey? What does a forest of honey mean? The Gemara tells us a forest of honey is actually a very specific terminology because honey actually is compared to a forest. Ma'yar, just like when it comes to a forest, hatolish men b'Shabbos chayav chatas, you go into a forest and you start cutting down trees over there on Shabbos. Talach is if you do it by mistake, you chayav chatas. Afdvash, same thing is true with regard to honey. Harodim emenu b'Shabbos, if a person mistakenly takes honey out of a beehive on Shabbos, he's chayav chatas. So again, the fact that Rabbi Eliezer is so strict when it comes to to his classification of a beehive that's connected to the ground, where he calls that he considers that to be mechuber lekarka, connected to the ground, that's because a honeycomb or a beehive is very different than anything else. A beehive is different because the pasuk in Shmuel Aleph specifically refers to honey. It's connected to the ground as a forest. That's why in those cases it's considered to be connected to the ground. It can still be that Rabbi Eliezer is going to be of the opinion that when it comes to a pipe which is carrying water to a mikvah, if it was first etched out as a pipe and then connected to the ground, that will not be considered to be connected to the ground. It will still maintain its name as a keli, which is not mechuber lekarka, and therefore these two brises can indeed be consistent. So now we do not know who this Rabbi Eliezer is yet, who is inconsistent with this mikvah halacha, which says you have to first connect the piece of wood and then carve out the pipe. Ella, there must be Rabbi Eliezer didaf. Rabbi Eliezer of the daf. Now, this is not referring to Rabbi Eliezer learning daf Yomi, although I'll assume he probably did learn the daf. Makes sense, he learned the daf. But that's not what it's talking about over here. It's not. For it says, Daf shel nachtomen. You have a board of a baker. Rashbam tells us this board of the baker is one of two things. Either it was a board that was used to knead the dough. I would assume that it's probably not the best way to knead dough. I would have guessed using a bowl is probably a better way of kneading dough. But apparently, maybe if you're making so much dough, they have this massive board. They put the flour and the water on it, and they would knead it together. Yeah, maybe like in the matzah bakery, where they have like that thing that they jump up and down. Either way, it was this board that they would knead the dough on, or it says the Rashbam was simply a shelf that the bakers would use to display their bread. Either way, it's a flat board of wood. The halacha is daf shenachtomen shekavu bekoso. You built it into the wall. So now, why would you build it into the wall? Probably because you want it to be in either case. If it's a shelf, it makes sense why build it into the wall, because you want to put the bread there. And if it's indeed this kneading board, you want it to be solid in one place, so it's not going to move around when you're beating up that dough. So therefore, you take this piece of this baker's board, not to be confused with a meat board, but either way, you take this baker's board, shekava bakoso, you connect it to the wall. Rabbi Eliezer says it's tahar. It's considered to be mechuber lekarka. The Chachamim say it is susceptible to tumah, and it's not considered mechuber lekarka. Now, mani, Rabbi Eliezer. Now, this seems to be a problem because neither Rabbi Eliezer or the Chachamim make any distinction in this case. And therefore, the Gemara asks as follows: Rabbi Eliezer, if this brisa is going to be consistent with Rabbi Eliezer, hold on. then afilu chakaku l'b'sof kavo. The halacha by mikvah should be true, even if you first carve it out and then connect it. Because again, in this case, he had the staf shenachtomin. It was already considered to be a gemar keli. Why is it a gemar keli? It seems there's no base kibble over here, but nevertheless, it's considered to be a gemar keli because it had whatever needed to be done to it was done to finish off the process of making this into the vessel the vessel of its particular purpose. Now, clearly, Rabbi Eliezer makes no distinction. You connect this board to the ground or to the house; it's considered to be mechubar l'karka. No requirement of first connecting it and then finishing the keli. Rabbanan, if you want to tell me that this is going to be Rabbanan, afilu kavah v'so chakaku. Even if you first connect it and then you go ahead and carve it out. In our case, there's no distinction. So therefore, this doesn't seem to be consistent with everybody. Gemara says, I feel kavul so chakiku nami. Gemara says, la'olam Rabbi Eliezer. Really, this price is consistent with Rabbi Eliezer. Shani pshuti kli'etz, in this case, it's talking about a wooden board, and it's a flat wooden board. Shani pshuti kli'etz, the tumah drabanan. Like pshuti kli'etz are only tamei midrabanan. In other words, generally speaking, when we have any type of tumah, it has to have a base kibble. It has to have some type of area in it where it can hold onto something and it won't fall out. Now, a pshute kli'et is kind of like I don't know what it's called, like a pizza board, the thing that they use to get the pizza out of the oven. It's flat. So there's no base kibble over there. Now, it's true that it had its gemar keli, but that's only midrabanan. Therefore, in this case, Rabbi Eliezer is going to be even more mekel and say, even if you first connected it to you first made the gemar keli, you took it to your wood shop, you sanded it down, you polished it up, you made it look all beautiful, and then you went ahead and you connected it to the ground. Nevertheless, says Rabbi Eliezer, it's still going to be considered connected to the ground. Why? Because the whole tumah over here is only tumah midrabanan, and therefore he's going to take his kula a step further and say, even if it was already a keli and then connected to the ground, it'll still be considered connected to the ground. However, when it comes to mikvah is midoraisa, and therefore you have to first connect it to the ground and only then hollow it out. The Gemara says, hold on a second. Is that line that I just got finished saying 30 seconds ago actually true? That when it comes to the mikvah, the psol, the disqualification of drawn water is midoraisa? That's not true. Top of samach vav on the base. V'akaim alon we paskin drabanan. That's only tamei midrabanan. So again, what is this talking about that it's drabanan? Like I mentioned before, it's true. If you look back in Rashbam, the Rashbam quotes here. The Rashbam's on the previous page, and he says, Mechlal de Shiva do Raisa. 1 second. Because it's a little bit long, I just want to find exactly the place where it is. Yeah, it's the last line in Rashbam before it starts to get really wide. So I'll show you the distinction very clearly in the Rashbam. So the last medium-sized line in Rashbam and Samach Vav Amid Aleph, he says, Aval El, earlier, Gabi Tzinar, when it came to a pipe, Shemayim She'uvim, when it comes to drawn water, Poslinus HaMikvah Minat Torah. That disqualifies the mikvah min Torah. And he goes on to explain, where do we know this from? Kedetanya, like we learned in Toras Kohanim, Yachal Mila Mayim Al Kesefo V'asa Mikvah Batchili Tahar. You might think if a person just fills buckets of water and carries it to the mikvah and pours it in, it'll be tahar. Talmud Lomar, the pasuk tells us, Mayan Mayan bar umikvah, right? It says Mayan. Ma Mayan bidei shemayim, just like a stream it's formed bidei shemayim, naturally. Af mikvah bidei shemayim, the same thing is true, that a mikvah needs to be formed bidei shemayim. So clearly we see that the disqualification of a mikvah being built or constructed out of drawn water is pasul midaraisa. Now, we're going to see that that's true, that a mikvah which is completely drawn water is pasul midaraisa. However, the other case, if you go a little bit further in Rashbam, go down to the 5th line in the wide lines, he writes Rashbam writes very clearly, Shimhaya mikvah memsa. If you had a mikvah that was already memsa, v'nasan sa she'uvim, you poured in a sa'ah of drawn water. V'natal sa'ah, then you took out a cup of water. Ad kama, until at what point is the mikvah going to be considered completely drawn water? Rabbi Yochanan Amar ad rubo. Yochanan says until the majority. So again, I'm pointing out everything that I mentioned earlier, which is when we talk about the disqualification of drawn water, there are 3 possible cases. One case is that all 40 sa'ah are just simply drawn water. You take your garden hose and fill up a hole in your backyard. That's not going to work. That's pasul midaraisa. The case which is drabanan is if the mikvah was already kosher and then you just poured in so much water from the tap, but at the same time you also took out water that was there previously. In such a case, that'll be pasul midrabanan. That's why we keep going back and forth. So again, machlal d'shiva d'oraisa. It seems like you're telling me that ma'im shuvim is pasul midrabanan. No, some vavam based on the top. But kaima we paskin drabanan that this psul of a mikvah that has drawn water is only midrabanan. V'od. Furthermore, we can't say that the reason why Rabbi Eliezer is going to be so lenient in the case of the board of this baker is because it's pshute klietz. That's not true. Ha'amar Rabbi Yossi ben Rabbi Chanina. Rabbi Yossi, the son of Rabbi Chanina, said, "B'daf shel mateches machlokas." They were talking about a metal board. Now, this metal board, everybody agrees, is susceptible to tumah midaraisa. So that, in other words, that can't be. The Gemara says, okay, Olam Rabbanan. It must be that case was the Rabbanan. So why is it that when it comes to the Rabbanan, when it comes to the board, they're going to be so machmir, even if you first connect it and then carve it out? Bashani she'iva drabanan. When it comes to now, again, it's interesting. Now we're referring to ma'im she'uvim, which is pasul midrabanan. She'iva is only pasul midrabanan, and therefore they're going to be more mekel there. Where it says, hold on, if we're talking about a psul of ma'im she'uvim, which is drabanan, if the whole problem with ma'im she'uvim is a case of ma'im she'uvim, which is drabanan, again, a case where the mikvah was kosher, and you're just disqualifying it by adding too much ma'im she'uvim and also taking out some of the water from the mikvah, that's only midrabanan. Why do you have to go so far as to say if to first connect it and then carve it out? Even if you first carved it out and then connected it, that should also be fine. Gemara says, no, shani hasam, in such a case, ikatoras kli alav betalash. In such a case, the Chachamim don't want to go so far to say that something which already was considered to be a vessel in and of itself, it's on sale in Home Depot, it's there as a regular pipe, it's a vessel, it's a keli. You can't go ahead and take away its name of a keli just by connecting it to the ground. Okay, so it doesn't seem like we really have a Rabbi Eliezer yet, which is going to be inconsistent with that brisa of mikvah. The Gemara goes on to another question. By Rabbi Yosef, it's not exactly the same topic, but once we're talking about connecting things to the ground, the Gemara asks the following question: Megish shamim shechashav aleim ladiach es ha'etz drabulin mahu. Quick introduction. The halacha is for something to be able to be susceptible to tumah, it has to get wet. When it gets wet, getting wet has to have 2 criteria. First of all, you have to want it to get wet. Number 2, it only works when we're talking about something which is disconnected from the ground. If something is connected from the ground and it gets wet, it doesn't become tamei. So if you have a plant which has vegetables growing on it, and those vegetables become wet from the rain, they're not yet susceptible to becoming tamei. It's only once they're disconnected from the ground and they get wet, and the wetness that happened beratzon, you wanted it to happen. If that happens, then those fruits or those vegetables will be susceptible to tumah. So the question is, what happens if you have rainwater that's coming down, and you were happy that the rainwater was coming down because you wanted it to wash off your itztrabulin. What are itztrabulin? Just a reminder from yesterday. So it's kind of like this, maybe like a ring or something that goes around. It seems like they would build their machtashas on top of this. Their grinding equipment would go on top of this itztrabulin. Now they would get dirty. They would get dirty from whatever it was that you were grinding or you were smashing in your pestle and mortar with your pestle and mortar. Then so now it's about to rain. You're like, oh great! I was just about to go outside with my pail of water to wash off my itztrabulin. Guess what? Hashem's doing the job for me. It's going to rain. So you're happy that your itztrabulin is getting washed off. What's the halacha? Mahu lizrayim. What's the halacha with regard to zrayim? In other words, you didn't have in mind that it should get those zrayim wet, but you were happy initially that the rain was coming down to wash off your itztrabulin. The Gemara says, "Alibad Rabbi Eliezer to Amar Kol Mechubel Karka Rika Karka," according to Rabbi Eliezer, who says that anything which is connected to the ground is considered connected to the ground. Therefore, lo tibayalach. It's not a question because remember we said that the water has to go ahead and touch something which is disconnected from the ground. This itztrabulin is connected to the ground, and therefore it's not going to meet the criteria. Ki tibayalach, I'll leave it to Rabbanan. We're going to only ask this question according to the Rabbanan. The Amri eni kakarka. They say it's not like karka. What's the halacha? The Gemara says teku. We're not sure. Again, because we're not sure if the Rabbanan's line is their halacha, their psak is only true with regard to real estate, and that's really a discussion of ayin rahu mocher or ayin tovu mocher. But maybe with regard to tumah would be different. The Gemara is not sure. The Gemara says teku, let it stand. And Mirz Hashem, at some point we'll figure this out. The Gemara has one more halacha that's related to this. Shalach lei Rav Nechemya Breid Rav Yosef l'Rabba Breid Rav Huna Zuti Linarda. So Rabbi Nechemya, the son of Rabbi Yosef, sent Rabbah, the son of Yehuda Zuti, in Narda the following line. He said to him as follows: Ki asya hach itzel lekamach. When this woman comes before you, agva isor nichse afilu mitztrabule derechai. What's this talking about? The halacha is midaraisa. When a person passes away, his male sons inherit his estate, and they have a requirement to be able to support the female children, the daughters. Now, that's true with regard to most things. However, she also gets isor nechasim. She gets a tenth of the property, which is given to her. It's like this: she will have a respectable amount to be able to help her get to her wedding. That's the halach. So although the estate is divided among the sons, and then the sons have the requirement to go ahead and take care and support the daughters, nevertheless, she still is entitled to 1/10 of the father's possession, but that halacha is, it only comes from mechubar lekarka. So now he sent to him, he said as follows: Agva isar nichse, collect 1/10 of her possessions, afilu mitztrabuli derechayim, even from this connected piece, this ring of the mill. So you see very clearly that we were considering this ring of the mill to be connected to the ground, just like Rabbi Eliezer's halacha. And it goes so far as to being part of the real estate that the daughter would get 1/10 of. Amar Rav Ashi said, Ki avina be'er of Kahana. When I was by Rav Kahana, Magvinin, we would collect this 1/10 of his possessions. Afilu mi amla debati, that even get it from the rent of the home. So if the father owned real estate, he was collecting rent from it, the halacha was her 1/10 of the property that she would get would come even from the rent of those homes. It's important to just point out at the end of this Gemara, the Kaimalan. Here, let's go back to the Rashbam. Afilu mitztrabuli, Rabbi Lazar, like Rabbi Lazar, to call a mechubar lekarka, anything which is connected to the ground, hareu kakarka is like ground. Now, goes on the Rashbam. Upirish Rabbeinu Chananel. Rabbeinu Chananel explained, "V'kaimalan hachi." We actually indeed do paskin like Rabbi Eliezer. The less man de palagala. No one seems to argue on him. Udir v'yakol parnasa. Eastern Nichse Mekarkoi V'Lamatatlihi Afil Bizman Azeh Tahad Behedya Pasuk Rava Parak Matzis Isha. In other words, he says that's how we paskin, and he goes on later on. The next Rashbam Agva Mitzrabuli Deina and Metatlin Kivu Bekarka Shemina Minei says Rashbam the Sugya the Shmaitza Kerbalazar Salka. What's the halacha? After all said and done, we passing direct by Lazar. The savar kol mechubel karka rev karka. He's of the opinion that any time you connect something to the ground, it assumes its identity as being part of the ground. Kain pirsh ben chanan of hachi paskinan aliba tehilchasa v'chein ikar. So at the end of this entire Gemara, we do indeed pasking like Rabbi Eliezer that any time you have something which is connected to the ground, it is considered to be part of the ground for all halachic purposes. We'll stop here for today. Have a wonderful day and a wonderful Shabbos.